In the early 1900s, the United States continued to industrialize, with the Industrial Revolution being the driving force behind this rapid growth and development in American industry. With this innovative change came an increased need for women to take part in American society in ways such as entering the workforce. This helped to impact the feminist movement, where women sought an equal status to men in society. The inferiority of women compared to men in the United States was demonstrated as women were given unequal pay, an example of discrimination in the workplace, and denied suffrage, the right to vote. Because of this inequality, many feminists worked for rights such as suffrage, equal pay, and an equal social status to men, as all of these rights would establish them as equal to men in society. Women advocated their voices to be heard through ways such as protesting, campaigning, and petitioning. As a result of the Industrial Revolution, the United States feminist movement took place, an area of American history where women took a more active role in the workplace and fought for equal pay, status, and the right to vote. The Industrial Revolution, which took place in both the 19th and 20th century of the United States, was an important changing point in American history that altered American industry like never before. With the invention of new machines, such as the assembly line, worker productivity and output increased. Mass production occurred within the Industrial Revolution, which made goods more affordable and plentiful. With this increasing amount of industry, the demand of workers in urban industrial centers increased. Because of this demand for workers, women were brought into the workforce and left the traditional life of taking care of the household behind. There were many factors behind women entering the work industry. Employment within areas of work like the mail industry allowed young women to earn their own financial support and money without dependence on their families. Wages provided women financial means to save for future marriage. Another major reason was that wages made from the workforce provided a way for women to financially support their family and provide more income. For example, women began working in the cotton textile mills industry in England in the late 18th century and in the United States in the early 19th century. Young single women were known for working in the Lowell, Massachusetts textile mills, and their wages were vital to the survival of working-class families. In general, the Industrial Revolution's demand for more workers and women's personal motives brought them together, and therefore brought more women into the workforce. Beneath the exterior, however, there were cracks. While the Industrial Revolution brought many women into the workforce, it also showcased the inequality and inferiority of women compared to men in the United States. Women were given unequal salary compared to men, had an unequal social status compared to men, and were denied suffrage, the right to vote. Women fought against this discrimination in various ways. The women who advocated their rights in the three S's, salary, social status, and suffrage, were known as the feminists. Harriet Stanton Blatch, an American feminist, spoke out against unequal pay or salary, the first S. She was a member of the Equality League of Self-Supporting Women, a feminist organization that fought for equal rights for women. Stanton Blatch was the main writer of a letter addressed to the governor of New York, and in it she states, "If women perform the same work as men, then they should be given equal pay." This shows that Stanton Blatch believed in equal pay for women. She also requests a full governmental inquiry into the workplace of women in the Industrial Revolution's workforce. This demonstrates how the Industrial Revolution's employment of women made them unequal in terms of pay, and feminist advocacy resulted from this. Feminist advocacy for areas like equal salary, one of the three S's that the feminists advocated rights in, would eventually cause a revolution in women's rights, and, later, reform in these areas of salary, status, and suffrage. The revolution in American feminism in the 1900s was a reaction itself to the Industrial Revolution and its employment of women into the workforce. When women advocated their rights in salary, status, and suffrage, it demonstrated a changing point in American feminism and therefore a revolution in American history. Feminist advocacy in rights such as equal pay, as shown in Stanton Blatch's letter, drew recognition in American society. Reform in equal pay for women occurred in laws like the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. Within this act, one of the provisions was that the pay scales between men and women were equalized. Another act that reformed unequal pay for women was passed later on in the 20th century, the Equal Pay Act of 1963. It prohibited sex discrimination in the workplace, and therefore prevented employers from paying women lower wages than men. These reforms in the first S, salary or equal pay, demonstrate the Industrial Revolution's role in causing these reforms, as it brought women into the workforce. and the discrimination of women in their pay within the workforce led to feminist advocacy and recognition of their rights. Feminists also worked for an uplifting of their social status, the second S of the three S's. The idea of an equal social status for women was directly tied into the granting of women's suffrage, the third S. In an email interview with Professor Daniel Rogers of Princeton University, he discusses the feminists and the origin of the fight for suffrage, one of their main goals. He states, "There is a very important indirect link between women in the Industrial Revolution's workforce and women's demand for suffrage. The most important women's suffrage advocates were privileged middle-class women, rather than industrial wage workers. In the 1900s and 1910s, some of these suffrage advocates began to take interest in working conditions of women industrial workers, and tried to persuade other middle-class women to buy goods only from union-organized clothing factories. These women began to see suffrage as not only a way of giving women equality, but of also bringing a new social conscience to politics, and a new sensitivity to the needs of women and children. They began to create alliances with the leaders of women's labor unions to create a cross-class suffrage movement, and their success in doing so in the 1910s was what gave the suffrage movement its victory in 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment." This portion of the interview demonstrates the important connection between women working in the Industrial Revolution and the middle-class suffragists through their successful cross-class suffrage movement. This shows how the Industrial Revolution impacted the third S, suffrage, which many feminists believe that its granting would equalize women's social status, the second S. This was because as suffrage would give women a larger say in society, their social status would equalize to correlate with this change. Women's suffrage advocacy was present in the forms of protesting, campaigning, and petitioning. Many feminists argued that a denial of women's suffrage was a denial of American democracy. In a petition signed by well-known feminists like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and more, called A Petition for Universal Suffrage, it asks the U.S. Senate for granting the vote to women. In a photograph of Alice Paul and Mildred Bryan, two American suffragists at a campaign to advocate Paul's Equal Rights Amendment, which stated, "Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied on account of sex." Advocacy like this showed that cross-class suffrage movements between middle-class suffragists like Paul and Anthony and industrial wage workers from the Industrial Revolution pushed forward the feminist movement and the third S, suffrage. Other suffrage advocacy, such as a poem called Let Her Come from the New York Times, dealt directly with the Industrial Revolution. In the poem, the unknown writer states that women can solve crime, alcohol, and pollution from the Industrial Revolution if they were granted suffrage and with it a higher social status. This shows the Industrial Revolution's impact on the second and third S, suffrage and social status. Responses to suffragist advocacy occurred, and an example was the Night of Terror in 1917, when feminists like Alice Paul, Lucy Burns, and other members of the National Woman's Party, a women's rights organization, protested outside the White House with signs that read, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" Arrests and violence occurred against these feminists. It was a significant night that exposed the fight for women's suffrage. 3 years later, in 1920, women finally achieved the vote through the 19th Amendment. This was an example of reform caused by the feminist movement, which was a revolution in the sense that never before were women's rights so largely debated. In Woodrow Wilson's address to the Senate on the 19th Amendment, he states, "I regard the concurrence of the Senate in the constitutional amendment proposing the extension of the suffrage to women as vitally essential to the successful prosecution of the great war of humanity in which we are engaged. It is my duty to win the war and to ask you to remove every obstacle that stands in the way of winning it." This reform demonstrates the importance of the cross-class suffrage movement between middle-class suffragists and the Industrial Revolution workers and its victory in granting the vote to women. All of these examples show that as a result of the Industrial Revolution, the United States feminist movement took place, an area of American history where women took a more active role in the workplace and fought for equal pay, status, and the right to vote. With the feminist movement being a reaction to the inequalities set on women by the Industrial Revolution and the three S's, a revolution and women standing up for themselves like never before took place. With this, reform occurred in the three S's, and the feminist movement showed to be a turning point in American history, with the Industrial Revolution being the cause behind it.